Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our event on the business of software innovation. And I really appreciate those who came today and took the risk that Washington would turn into a massive ice-bound ball of gridlock today, which is only marginally different from what happens every day in Washington, but occasionally can get particularly bad. But we don't expect any of that until well after this event is done. But I appreciate those that came in person, and I also appreciate those who are tuning in online for today's discussion. As always, we start with our security announcement. If something were to happen that would cause us to need to evacuate this room, I'll be your security officer and give you guidance either to depart the way you came in or to come out the back, depending on what the issue was, and tell you where to go. And I would also like to start by thanking the sponsor that made today's event possible, which is Northrop Grumman, and their support is greatly appreciated. I think it will shock no one for me to start by saying that software is pretty critical to defense. Software provides an increasing amount of the capability in our defense systems, and you can go through a laundry list of today's most advanced weapon systems and think about the degree to which they do what they do through software, or rather through the traditional means. And sometimes when I talk to folks out there and want to exemplify how this happens, I might refer to like a glass cockpit in an aircraft. And so we used to have sensors hardwired to gauges in a cockpit that gave us readouts of what was happening. And now you look at a modern aircraft and you see a glass cockpit and everything shows up as a virtual dial. I know I'm overstating the case slightly in the case of many aircraft, but we've really digitized and turned into software-defined capabilities, many of the things that historically have been done through hardware. And you see that when you look at the advantages of our most advanced weapon systems, and I'm mindful that I think the F-35 is going back to red flag for another expression of its dominance over their other aircraft, that it's really the software nature of the capabilities in these systems that is providing the edge that they have over the competition. But I would argue, and I have argued, that this transition that we're undergoing towards more software-defined capabilities is still not fully understood by any of us, maybe by Jeff, and it's certainly not been embraced by the system. And by the system, I mostly mean the defense acquisition system, although I think there's many other parts of our society and of the Pentagon that also have some distance to go to understand this transition. But as I mentioned, Jeff Bowling, who's here and is going to kick us off with some remarks, is the exception, that he's leading the way in thinking through how we can do a much better job of acquiring software. And when I say acquiring software, I mean big A acquisition, as in understanding what it can do for us, defining what we want it for, defining what we want it to do, and understanding how we can then meaningfully acquire that from industry and or develop it within industry to meet military needs. He is currently serving as Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord. He came to that position as having been Chief Technology Officer at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon, and was a Deputy CTO there before that. His background is with the United States Air Force, and a long career there, including several tours I saw at the Air Force Academy as a teacher. We're going to ask Jeff to come up and give us some opening thoughts on the work that he sees underway within the Department of Defense. And when he's done, then we're going to bring up our panel and we'll enter into a discussion. So, Jeff?
Hold your applause. Sorry, it's a tough crowd. Thanks. He overstated my level of, I think, understanding and expertise in how we totally transform the software industry for defense. We're certainly working on it. I'm going to rattle off some numbers, because one of the topics here was, what is DoD doing about software acquisition in the defense industrial base? So we've got a whole bunch of numbers staring us down. We've got 804, 805, 809, 813, 872, 873, 874, 868. These are all sections in the various national defense authorization acts. Essentially, Congress is inside DoD's decision loop here, telling us how to fix software more quickly than we can actually address some of the problems and implement them. So hopefully we're going to take, one of the ones I've been most heavily involved with was the 872 panel, which was the Defense Innovation Board's Software Acquisition Practices panel. That report is wrapping up to a conclusion, getting ready to be delivered to DoD in April and then to come back to Congress in May. I'm excited about it. There's a lot in there. Surprisingly, there's not a ton that's new. I hope that the timing is right for some of these recommendations. We've been looking back in history at various other studies that have been done on acquisition reform, software technology, information technologies. We've been lamenting about this problem since the 70s, literally, when software first started to even be created for defense systems. And a lot of times we say the same things. So what I want to do to try to support the panel here and this year-long effort with CSIS is to try to help get to some of the solutions here. And I want to kick it off in a way that hopefully leads to some more panel discussions saying a number one imperative, at least in my opinion, is that the defense industrial base a healthy defense industrial base is critical to national security. And we're in this as partners. When I say we're in this as partners, DoD, the Defense Acquisition System, and the Defense Industrial Base, I think are in this as partners, and we need to solve this problem together, or we need to get better at this problem together. I think the acquisition pendulum swings. In some cases, we really want to incentivize competition and make it really brutal and drive profits as narrow as they can be, and I believe that's the wrong answer, especially for software. One of the things we talk about a lot is software is kind of interesting and unique that it's got value, and you'd like the market to reward the value of the software, not the cost to produce it. So there's a significant cost to produce a hardware item, like an F-35. If you go down and look at the assembly line in Fort Worth, there's a lot of cost to put that plane together. The software that goes on it is free to reproduce. It literally costs nothing to put another version of software on that thing. I don't think that should drive how we buy that software. I think we need to figure out a way that we value we reward industry for the value of that software, not just for the cost to produce it. So that's a subtle point that I'd like us to be able to comment on a little bit. Another thing is we also have to get, which is a challenge, one of my challenges to the industrial base is, we have to get to the point where one of the things that makes the open source community, the open source software community so vibrant is it's almost a need to share. If you've ever contributed to an open source project, I know a lot of us all benefit from massive amounts of open source software, even though we may not know it. There's a need to share in that community. I don't know how we do this, but I would like in the industrial base, amongst the companies, the big 5+1, the big 6, plus the next tier down, how could we get to this point where we have a sharing economy for DoD software where the company that develops the innovation and the software is rewarded for its value, but also their intellectual property rights are protected, and they can actually share that capability to other industrial-based companies, other weapon systems, and be rewarded properly. I use a few examples here. How many times have we paid for the software that calculates a firing solution or a targeting solution? How many times have we paid for software that provides precision navigation algorithms, timing algorithms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Many, many times. One of the few bright spots I see is there's a thing called GCAS, a ground collision avoidance system, that it looks like some of the software was pioneered in the F-16 for the automatic ground collision avoidance is also the same software that might be being put in the F-35 and the F-22. Now, it's no secret that all three of those airplanes are built by the same manufacturer, largely. Well, actually, a third of the F-35 is built by Northrop, right? But the prime is the same on all three of those, so maybe we're doing a little better there. But finding the right level of abstraction and way to protect intellectual property so that we can actually get to a point where we share and properly reward software, it's just an imperative that we have to be able to do, because then we can actually produce more capability through software and not reinvent and recreate the same stuff we've already done. And we can also, hopefully the quality will go up, security will go up, best of breed solutions will emerge more effectively. So So this is a big challenge to try to figure out how we move forward on this. So I'm welcoming the panel here because I'm about out of ideas. So.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thanks for kind of framing this. And I wrote down in my notes as you were talking, Congress is inside DoD's OODA loop on software acquisition, and that's true, I guess, in a lot of areas. But in software acquisition, I think it's a particularly interesting case because I know, having been in my former life a Hill staffer, Congress kind of asked the department to make radical change in its approach to software acquisition some years ago, the original 804, which was essentially do everything for software different without any definition of what that meant, what that would look like, how to do that. And it was not a provision that I directly worked on at the time, let me clarify, but one that we wrestled with over the years as we tried to say, well, is the department doing what Congress has asked? And it was kind of hard, I guess, to make the case that they were. But on the other hand, it was also hard to explain what Congress had asked the department to do, other than to change. So to my perspective, there's a lot more granularity and a lot more solidity to the efforts that are underway now. And I'm going to bring into the discussion our two additional crack panelists. To my right, Beth McGrath, who is Managing Director at Deloitte. She served as Deputy Chief Management Officer of the Department of Defense for several years and really tackled many issues associated with acquiring big software systems for the government, and now follows the issue very closely from the private sector. So thank you for being with us, Beth. And to her right, Brett Lambert, who is Vice President for Corporate Strategy at Northrop Grumman. He served in the last administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. So, Brett, you also have wrestled with the issue of this change in industry, and I'm going to just briefly steal your line before you get a chance to deliver it, just because it's fun, that you've been saying for many years that we're shifting from steel to silicon as the basis for defense innovation and for defense industry. And so you've really been tuned into this trend for a long time, in addition to seeing it in your current position. So, Beth, if you wouldn't mind giving us kind of your...
I don't really have anything more to say.
Sorry, I stole your whole talking point. Beth, if you wouldn't mind, kind of giving us your opening thoughts on how you see this issue, and then we'll let Brett do the same, and then we'll go into some dialogue.
Great, thank you. So as Andrew mentioned, I spent, I'll just say, many years in the Department of Defense in the acquisition space, but also as the Chief Management Officer. And I also had milestone decision authority for business IT. So that's really where sort of, I'll say, my background came in into direct contact with, I'll just say, the Hill's requests on do it faster. And so business IT seems like, super easy when you compare it to, F-35 or all of the other systems or major defense acquisition programs, but I found it to be probably one of the most challenging. And some of it has to do with, I'll use the term literacy of the department in terms of sort of how to buy and what to buy. And, the evolution of COTS to GOTS to COTS, and it wasn't really COTS because all we did was customize what we, the old way. We went then to like a quasi-ERP, the Enterprise Resource Planning, which by definition is a multifunctional piece of software. But we, made it our own, meaning we totally customized it and therefore lost its value in terms of what we bought. And then we figured out, using ERP out of the box is probably a better idea. And then how do we undo what we did for however many years we did that? And then, move into actual COTS and application development and APIs and the whole, platform app development cycle. So there's a huge evolution there, and just from a software side. And then you say, well, what are the users doing through all that conversation? And it depends. In the early days, it was, well, I'll take 2 years to figure out what my requirements are, hand them over to some developer, hope for the best. 2 years later, see what they produce. And 2 years later was fast, right? And this is IT that we're talking about and business that we're talking about. So this is HR, financial management. This is not precision, drop in payload somewhere. This is really just executing the business of defense, which is a multi-billion-dollar global business. And so how could we do that better? And so, you take then sort of waterfall, agile, all that kind of stuff, and you say, well, where are the users in this conversation? Because we took the users from sort of being in there in the beginning to now being there every day, this whole agile, modular, pick whatever suits you best. But it's a team sport, I think, as Jeff mentioned. It's a team sport between sort of users and, I'll use the word developers, but it's really configurers if you're talking about, business IT, and also industry. I mean, I will forever say that we government, and I was there long enough to still say we, although I am on the contractor side now, it should not be, commercial industry should not be guessing what the requirements are. There should be collaboration along the way so that when the government is ready to put a solicitation out, and the reason they put a solicitation out is because they need help doing something, a service, a platform, it's a something, they need help. So they need a teammate in the contractor workforce to help them deliver capability. And so contractors guessing, like, what do we think the government means by this solicitation, to me is the wrong answer. It's figuring out how to, communicate in an effective way that still maintains an appropriate level of competition, but also educates the contractor workforce in terms of, what the government wants. And then figuring out how to deliver the capability in an open source, based on standards way, such that you're delivering capability faster to the market. It's about speed to market. And I will say that, and I know you're like, hey, I only gave her 5 minutes. But it is trying to figure out how do you, inform the contractor base, get their user community in there, deliver capability, knowing it's not 100%. And I think that is where we also took, 10 years to deploy an ERP. That's crazy. It's how do you get, and I don't love minimally viable product. That just sounds like, I'm settling for something. We went from IOC to FOC, now we have this MVP, which sounds a lot better than minimally viable product. Like I want to be the MVP, but I don't know that I want to be the minimally viable product. But it is about let's put capability out there that people can use, and then let's iterate and grow it, just like we do every day as consumers. Like I want my iPhone to be the latest capability and serve me the best it possibly can. So this whole conversation about sort of the evolution and how do you buy software different, and I'll end by saying, focused on business outcomes, much more push to shared services and managed service. So it really requires, again, a partnership between government and industry to, again, achieve the outcomes that you need at a fair price point, which still enables profitability and growth of the industrial base, but at the same time delivers capability much faster. And the business environment is I'll say different that it's in the government, but it really at the end of the day, money is money and HR is HR, so we should be able to figure it out in a better, faster way. I'm not at all passionate about the project.
I just realized what my boss means when she calls me her MVP. Her minimally viable product. Yeah.
You said that, not me.
Well, I'm going to probably expand a little bit on what both of you have said, and I thought I'd try to do it in 3 buckets because you're always supposed to do things in 3 buckets. One was kind of putting the issue in context, and you alluded to this, why is software different? And then what I view, both from my time in industry and then in government and then back in industry, is almost these seemingly irreconcilable goals that the department faces when trying to work with more commercial industries or even the DIP. And then 1 or 2 points on where I think the path forward might be that would resolve some of the issues that both the government customer, the military, and companies see. So first, software should be seen as just one example of a transforming defense industrial base. And you alluded to my old phrase of, I called it steel to sand. It was really silicon, software, and services. And if you look back at the history of the industrial base, you could even 20 years ago, about 70% of the spend was in the steel part. Now, there are anomalies, whether they're ships or whatnot, but there was a huge transformation. And you witnessed it in things like when payloads became more expensive than buses in space. But you realize that the value of the product or service that was being offered was really a microelectronic based, which means it was silicon based, which means it had to have software. And that has completely flipped in most cases, particularly for the advanced systems, where now about 30% of our spend is on the physical metal part, and 70% is in the software and the silicon. So that's changed. At the same time, the acquisition system by which we acquire these products and services didn't change that much, and that's where all the frustration grew and all the eight XXs grew, was to try to catch up with that. But software itself is also different, and one of my frustrations when I was in the building, but also now back in industry, is people tend to look for one solution that can fit all of these, all the software problems, and not all software is created equal. I have software that came with my dishwasher, and it's in a closed system, and it works every day, and I don't know how to fix it if I could, and as long as the dishwasher works, it's probably 5% of the cost. It's easier to, get a new dishwasher. But I also have software in my car that updates every day, and it kept me from hitting a scooter coming down here this morning. So to me, that software is more valuable because it's actionable, it's providing a day-in, day-out service, and it needs to get updated, it needs to get refreshed. So making the point that we're trying to find a solution for software acquisition, I think you have to even get a little bit more granular and talk about the types and the results of the activities that software is performing. So I certainly care more about the software in the car than I do about the software in the dishwasher. The seemingly irreconcilable goals, from the customer's point of view, from the department's point of view, and frankly, as a citizen, my point of view, you really do want to avoid vendor lock. I mean, there's fancier ways to say it, but what you want to avoid if you're an acquisition executive is being in a position where you've acquired a piece of kit or a piece of software, and now you're beholden to that single entity, right? And that you can't make changes to it, you can't update it, you can't refresh it, and you're kind of held captive to the individual who created that. That's completely reasonable. That's a completely reasonable fear. I lived and you lived. While we were serving, we all lived with variations of this theme where we were trying to be fair, but we also needed to be good stewards of the taxpayers, and we also needed to execute and to get product into the field. So it's very reasonable. It's a very reasonable aspiration. The other goal is to leverage the best that the commercial world, and here I would put as part of that commercial entity the defense industrial base, the best they have to offer as they migrated away from more waterfall processes and actually doing really creative and almost instantaneous upgrades, adjustments, which is what our clients, what the warfighters are demanding. So you want to tap into that access. You also want to tap into the amazing talent pool, the human capital pool, let alone the resources that are out there to make these capabilities possible and increase the performance of your product. So you want to tap into that. Now you want to do that both on the commercial and the defense industrial base because of the investments that are being made, but also because the department itself does not have the capacity or the capability to replicate everything that's going on in the private industry, nor should they, to make their products capable. And so there was an old line in when the space industry was first taking off, and a general that I admired quite a bit was asked, well, what are you doing about commercial space? And he famously said, I don't want to ride commercial space, I want to get lost in it. And I think there's a real opportunity for the department to leverage what the capabilities are in the commercial world, but it requires a different business model than the one that's being pursued now. And that's the kind of the last point, which is, where do we go? I think DoD is trying to achieve both goals, and industry, academia. The one agreement that I think everyone can come together on is that's really hard. in such a fast-paced market where you have some commercial companies who, because of processes and procedures, would prefer not to participate in the opportunities that the government has. You have some traditional defense contractors who are frustrated. They don't want to make those investments and live in what they would view as a command economy where they're just being paid for one thing and then they turn over all their IP. I do believe that smart people are now coming together and looking at the past studies and trying to craft a framework and a roadmap ahead. You know, the DBB study kind of started it back in 14. If you have a chance to read the DSB study from 18, I mean, they just in their executive summary, this one was just on the acquisition of defense software systems. They say the defense contractor base has not adopted many of the proven commercial sector software development techniques due to DoD culture, internal practices, and the government approach to contracting that disincentivize their adoption. So, I mean, I think this report, which is, you know, about a year old, is a good guidebook to describing the problem. And now the challenge you have is how do you move on? So that I think all of us would say it's a hard problem, very hard problem to solve. I would just, in conclusion, say that in the path forward, there are three things that we should keep top of mind, and they all, depending on what activities the department chooses to take and the Congress chooses to direct, they all intermingle. But obviously, one is IP. The fruits of the flavor, you know, of the labor of the innovators. If those are going to be dissipated quickly, then there's not an incentive, and our defense industrial base is created around incentives. And if you go too far in the disincentive way, it makes a lot more sense to be the second person in, not the first person, because you carry none of the risk. And you would want to avoid that if you're trying to solve your other goal of keeping innovation and keeping things moving forward. That leads to the second area, which is just the business model. We've got to adopt business models that are both practicable and actionable within the framework of the environment that you all have to operate in, which is now, I think, 3,200 pages or something. But those business models are very important. And in both of those cases, I think industry would be open to, even if they had proprietary information, there's a rational need for the government to be able to perform tests and make sure there's cyber resilience and security in those systems. So I think there's some middle ground that could be met short of making it just a government purpose software that would then be distributed to everyone. So I think there's reasonable minds on both sides. And then finally is thinking about, as software matures, and particularly the programs, the looking at the performance level of what you're trying to get after, and whether you're looking at products or services or sustainment. All of those have different nuances, but at the end of the day, you're trying to affect a product for a warfighter to execute the NDS or a plan. And so when you're contracting for those capabilities, I think it needs to be done at that kind of product level with that in context, instead of trying to continue to break down independent small stovepipes, where I tend to think we're getting wrapped around the axle, and having an adult with a more holistic view of what you're actually trying to accomplish, I think should be an overarching goal, instead of going down into these rabbit holes where, well, we're just going to do sustainment and outsource that and not do. So I think there's a lot of work to do on that part as well, because a lot of the software market, frankly, is in the sustainment and the upgradings and the hooks that you can tie onto open source and open architectures. So I'd leave you with three thoughts. I think the DoD is making good progress, and I think the fact that you're there is a great sign. I think the A&D industry, and to some extent the commercial industry, is anxious to see how this turns out, and the A&D industry in particular is willing to help. And the final one is it is hard, and I have no belief whatsoever that it's going to get any easier. So you just got to get used to hard, because it's a hard problem.
Well, Brett, you reminded me of the classic Simpsons episode where Bart runs for class president, and he declaims the smart kid who's running and saying, he says there are no easy answers. I say he hasn't looked hard enough. So, Jeff, you seem like you wanted to respond to a couple things, so I want to give you that option.
One of the big things is, so that this DSB study, great study. It turns out that in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, in Section 868, which was one of those numbers I read earlier.
What are the eights?
868 was, Congress said, oh, by the way, go do those 7 things. So we're currently working on doing those 7 things, which a lot of those are similar to the recommendations that the Defense Innovation Board is making as well. And so the one actually really hard one in there is number 7, which was not part of, that ANS is not specifically looking at, which is, oh, by the way, go figure out how to make AI explainable.
Oh, right.
AI and machine learning explainable. I think that's the really tough one in there. And so.
But you can create AI that will do that for you, so just work on that.
Oh, okay. I got it. Sorry, go.
Well, there's a lot of great issues that have been raised, and so I hope to dig down on as many of them as possible. But 2 issues that really struck me and that I think cut across all 3. Jeff, you started by raising the issue of why do we pay for the same thing over and over again? And then you raised the issue immediately, almost immediately, that if we would have more sharing of code across the industry, we would also have to figure out, okay, how do you compensate, whoever developed the code so that they're not just, everyone else isn't free riding on that effort. On the same token, if you're from the Department of Defense perspective, you say, well, I paid for it once, so free riding is kind of what I want, right? Because I paid for it. So I want to ride it for some time. So you want to get the incentives right. You want to have the ability to reuse. You don't want to cut down the ability to, to innovate and to iterate on that initial development. Brett, you also raised the issue of how do you, the bigger part of the software market potentially being sustainment and upgrade, rather than just building the thing the first time. And I would argue that going forward, hopefully that's an increasing share. As you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, that the warfighter is demanding capability that delivers, right away, essentially, almost instantaneously to need. And so if we're going to do that, it's going to be through a lot of rapid upgrades. And Beth, I think this ties into your comments about how do we not try to reinvent the wheel, leverage the commercial capabilities that are out there, not try to have everything be custom and GOTS to the nth degree. So trying to tie those things together, are there like obvious tools, are there mechanisms that are proven either in the commercial world or what we've done with ERPs or what we've done previously that enable those things to work? Are there success cases we can look at where this has worked?
I'll start. I don't have a full answer, but I'll start by saying one of the statements you made about the word you used was code, like we paid for the code. I want to try to change the narrative on the fact that we want to share software capability. It doesn't necessarily imply code, because technologically we've got levels of abstraction. We tried to do massive code reuse in the 70s and 80s, and we even tried to make everybody write everything in the same language, right? And I don't think that works. It's not the right level of abstraction for that level of sharing. So something in my gut tells me that the service level or the container level, the actual physical instantiation of that service in some kind of an executable container, is a really good level of abstraction for sharing of capability. And then you get to define how big and small that capability gets. But I think when we talk about sharing and reuse, I think we shouldn't always focus on code, because people get really visceral and emotional about, you can't have my source code. So.
Yeah, I'm still upset about all those hours in those ADA classes that I spent.
I didn't say the word.
Yeah, okay, all right. No, I think there is, I believe that the reuse issue, but also in theory, it's a razor and a razor blade kind of issue. In some cases, you would like your capabilities, your software, to be reused many, many times, but you would like to be rewarded for that or in some way incentivized. And I think that's where you're getting to the collaborative model, and where you can, and we need to work out mechanisms. But it's not just government-to-government mechanisms. Industry itself has to work out mechanisms. In the commercial world, they've made more progress in that than I think when we involve the government in those commercial to commercial relationships, that's where it gets complicated, because they're trying to figure out what piece of that the government gets. I believe that the government has very significant roles in reviews of security and verification, and a lot of the security aspects of any kind of software that is delivered, and therefore it needs full scope access. But when it comes to then using or reusing some of that software code for another purpose, if it's possible to do that, it makes great economic sense. But just as if I sell 3 books instead of 1 for those 2 other books, the industry is going to want some kind of remuneration for that sale and not just see more books being published by the day. And so I think that's where the disconnect is sometimes comes, and also what makes the commercial world very nervous about moving into this step, moving in with the government customers and creating what may be viewed as precedents for their other software and sales. Now, I know other foreign companies require some of that more transparent for commercial industry, and that's a model I don't think we want to replicate, but it's certainly one we could go down. But I think at the end of the day, the innovation that results from that may not give you the outcome you're looking for.
So then from a business IT perspective, and again, I mentioned ERPs before, what's really interesting is when the department would acquire, and it's mostly SAP or Oracle, I said PeopleSoft as well, they would acquire it for, let's say, an accounting system or an HR system. And if they then wanted to turn on let's use accounting. They bought it for accounting, they got one of the ERP vendors, and now they wanted to turn on the module that does HR. Well, not everybody thought that they could do that. They thought that, oh no, it's competition and contracting, therefore you have to compete for the HR module, which makes honestly no sense. You bought an ERP because it's a multifunctional capability set, yet the acquisition process doesn't always, in fact, I think never enabled somebody to then just say, oh, I now want to turn on the HR module, or I want to turn on the the supply chain or whatever the modules are. And so I feel like coming to grips with the understanding when we buy something like an ERP system that is a multifunctional capability, that we should maximize the capability that we bought. And so this whole, I'll call it whatever the 800 series of reports are from the Hill saying, hey, do this faster, sort of collides with, I'll call it Competition and Contracting Act, which is a piece of legislation that doesn't enable the department to actually go do things more, sort of with more agility. And so and then coupled with the change management, so even just within the acquisition community, allowing and enabling people to pivot and move is hard, because people aren't used to that. They're very accustomed and comfortable with the structure that the department provides, and it's the way it's been done for decades. And so it clashes, and I know, we put out, I think when I can't remember if Ash Carter, or I think it was Ash Carter was there, we did this business capabilities lifecycle, in which you'll remember, Andrew, which was supposed to get at IT, especially the business systems, are not weapon systems, so let's stop pretending like they are from an acquisition process. And the hardest thing was to get everybody to shift their mindset to sort of actually do things in a much more agile commercial way. And so I really feel like they were told, hey, here's this green field, go take it, but really they didn't have either the will or really top cover to then go do that. And so looking at how do you change the buying, and then the incentive structure on, IT from a contractor perspective. So you mentioned, I think a couple people mentioned sustainment. So there's development and sustainment. And on the IT, again, business IT, on sustainment, they really want that price to drop. It's just sustainment. We want the price so we want the price point to go down. And so we're willing to pay for, I'll call it, less experience. someone who could just keep the lights on, keep the thing running. But I think then you're trading off the, then how do I maximize the capability? Because then I'm just going to, a lower level of skill set. I'm buying a lower level of skill set, yet I have this expectation of I want then the latest technology. And so these conversations need to come together to say, go back to the value that Jeff mentioned. That says, I'm in for the long game. I don't want vendor lock, but I want to have the best capability looking into the future so that as the environment change, which it does every moment of every day, that I am positioned to move. And right now, the way things work, both from a cultural perspective and an acquisition process, is that, you're not positioned to move and you're not positioned to keep up, and therefore we're always in a catch-up game. And I feel like in commercial, they do what it takes to then do the next thing, right? An ERP implementation, if it's a year, it's almost too long, right? You're in, you're out, but you understand the business environment, you understand the business outcomes you're trying to achieve. You need an upgrade, you do a Salesforce, or a ServiceNow, whatever, you do an API kind of development, and you get it done because you can't afford not to. In the government, we think we can afford not to, and I just wish we'd have the same intolerance, in government, and the same capability from a policy and a statute perspective that enables us to move faster, to keep up more with actually what's out there. And so I do feel like there's this huge sort of tension between what we actually could do and what capabilities are out there and what we're enabled to do through the process and the change management paradigm.
Yeah, these words, sometimes I hear these words and I have a reaction that I have to comment on. The thing of talking about sustainment, I'm trying hard to convince the department that we don't sustain software. We invest in it forever. We have the ability to continuously deliver new capability through software. It's going to be a cost. The cost isn't probably not going to go down. Let's just hope that as the cost either stays the same or goes up, we get more and more capability from it. We have to actually accept the fact that from a computing and hardware perspective, we have to buy brand new stuff every couple of years. We have to continuously upgrade the hardware in the computing base, which drives continuous attention to the hosting of the software. So it's a continuous cost. I'm a little naive sometimes. Early when I started this job in the Pentagon, I met with Bob McMahon, who is the assistant director, for sustainment. And I said, I'm trying to kill the term software sustainment. And he looks at me and goes, you realize I'm in charge of sustainment, right? And I'm like, yeah. So I'm like, yeah, but we have to think about it differently, that it's a continuous investment. And from that investment, the thing we have to do is make sure that we get continuous capability out of that investment. But it's not going to go away. It was like 3 or 4 years ago I started telling people, and I don't think I coined this term at all, so I'm not trying to say that, but that software is never done, that there is no definition of done really for software. And the first time people heard that, they hated it, because they're like, well, I'm buying a piece of software. I want that thing to be done. I want you to tell me that it's wrapped up and it's in my little weapon system or it's in my business system and it's done and I don't have to mess with it again. I'm like, it's just not the case. That's just not reality. So we just have to, we have to learn to live with that and then capitalize on it.
I think one of the issues that we've kind of danced around is just the human capital issue of the people in charge of these efforts. The expertise within the department. I mean, for sustainment, if they view software as just paint, for an existing system, and why can't we get the paint cheaper? It's just going to coat it, and not having them aware of what it really means, adding extra capabilities, even probably creating new capabilities, and seeing it in that light as opposed to I just have to keep it afloat, or it's another piece of metal. It's hard, and when the industry needs to go out and get a lot of software engineers, they go out and they invest a lot of money and they get a lot of software engineers. The department doesn't have that flexibility as much as we would all like them to have, to sustain the expertise that is probably necessary to have some of these hard questions answered, you know, and I know the department has taken steps to do, you know, some of the software cores and trying to get more expertise in, and they've made some success, but I'm not sure it's still permeated through the acquisition process to the degree, you know, to the level of importance that everything we buy relies on software. You wonder how many of the PMs have a lot of software experience as they go up the ranks and how important that is. And on the one I think that you didn't mention that I think the department would take great credit for is when we did that ERP. You know, it's not equipment, it's a piece of, you know, they didn't paint it green. So I thought that was excellent. They left it the color it was when it came in the building, so, yeah.
If there was a way to paint it, though.
If there was a way to paint it, they would have painted it, yeah.
Well, you know,
Sorry,
Jeff, go ahead.
he brought up workforce. This is one of the things, anytime we have these discussions, workforce always comes up, and I think it's the actual hardest problem and the most pervasive problem. Culture and workforce, but those two go kind of hand in hand. A lot of the problems we have are not at all technology problems. And in some cases, many cases, they're not actually legal, like federal acquisition regulation problems either. There's a lot of flexibility, and especially if you get creative, built into the DFARs and the FAR already. It's really about people and expertise, and I think that's an area we've done the worst, actually. I have a little story that there's a little innovation cell that the Air Force came up with that was originally founded by an Air Force captain and a GS-13. And they were successful, and as they started to innovate and do better, if they had been a commercial company, what would have happened? Probably an adult board of directors would have been established by the investors, but they would have let that team run, and they would have promoted them or let them do whatever they needed. What did the DoD do?
15s and
We brought a bunch of 15s and colonels in and reined back those innovative late 20, early 30-year-old GS-13s and captains and basically stifled and killed that innovation. So we really have trouble incubating innovation. I think, incubating it. We actually innovate reasonably well, both in the industrial base and in the military, but once we have that little spark of innovation, we're terrible at incubating it and letting it grow and scale. So,
good at sparks.
yeah. Sorry.
Okay. I do want to, workforce keeps coming up, and I think it is critical. So I'm going to circle back just briefly to the terminology, but I don't want to leave the workforce issue either. So it's going to remain in the discussion. But I did want to say that I think, Jeff, your point about the terminology used is pretty significant, and it may sound to someone who hasn't experienced the joy of government internal workings the way folks on this stage have, like a silly point. But you know, these terms have pretty significant implications, right? So sustainment is something that you pay with O&M. Mm-hmm. O&M is 1 year money. It generally isn't supposed to buy new capability. So if I'm sustaining something in government, you know, mindset, ergo, I'm not supposed to be adding capability to it. I'm supposed to be doing a limited, discrete set of things that are payable by O&M dollars, and those O&M dollars are very flexible in the sense that, you know, they're very flexible. I'm going to leave it at that. But on the other hand, they are constrained at the macro level of what O&M is supposed to be used for. And so there's all kinds of other issues that come up when you use terminology. Another one that came to mind is, you know, sustainment. Okay, now I've got to think about the 50-50 rule. And am I doing sustainment in a depot, or am I allowing industry to do it? If I'm allowing industry to do it, I'm going to come up against, at some stage along the way, the 50-50 policy. And not speaking to the merits of the policy, I've now introduced a big new complexity. And so the more I push into a basket of things that I call sustainment, I am now bringing into play bigger and bigger realms of complexity in what I'm doing. So I think that point is a critical one, so I wanted to foot stomp it.
Well, so I'll add, though, you know, this gets back to the culture, and, you know, as consumers, if we bought a product and the manufacturer had it made it better, and we're using, you know, I'm saying software, then we would, as consumers, expect to have the best. You know, the latest, the cutting edge to enable me to, you know, do the things I need to do. And so like I said, the mindset and the government needs to change, and then the way we buy things, it has to be with an expectation for development. And I get that there are rules around, that govern money, and they're important, but which says that we need to, call it, I don't know, modernization and sustainment or something that enables you to actually continue to move into the future. Because, when you're using the O&M money for the sustainment, like I said, being in the commercial space, I can tell you, it's a price point competition. It's essentially LPTA for most of the sustainment for business software. I mean, that's what it is, it's LPTA. And so so they're not looking for innovation. And so if they're not looking for innovation, then you don't compete. It's it's a race to the bottom from a price point. I'm not talking about skill sets and capability to companies, but so you have to change that to enable, innovation and forward progress. I mean, not even innovation, it's forward progress to continue to happen so that the government has the latest capability it could have. And I feel like, I'll just say we government get in our own way. We have to get out of our own way and allow this to continue. Again, governed by the right, controls and checks and balances so that, I'll just say stupid stuff doesn't happen. But I feel like we over govern, and therefore, it feels way too stifled. And then I'll just say on the people part, I just don't. We could probably talk all day about how do you get and keep people in government and
Or get them back.
Or get them back. So it really is, even in my company, Deloitte is actually participating in the acquisition, the A&S industry program. So we've got actually 3 people from government right now as part of this exchange program. Other companies are also participating. But I will tell you, just to get that to happen it took almost a year. And because people are all worried about, all kinds of things in terms of, proprietary versus what can and can't do. And I'm like, again, I feel like there's got to be a way to get out of our own way to enable this collaboration to happen in a deliberative and structured way that protects the things that ought to be protected, but enables the cross-collaboration that we all say we want and need. But again, I think I applaud the effort. Again, we have 3 participants, which we're super happy about. But again, we need to do more and more and more of it.
Jeff, I was wondering, have you come up with an alternative to sustainment as a term of art for either all or some of what you're talking about?
I haven't. I keep calling it continuous capability delivery or continuous capability development or something. That's not as pithy a term as maintenance or sustainment. So, no, I'm open, actually. Maybe we should invent a word.
Yeah, I think you're gonna
Crowdsource
We have to
it.
find a domain name that's available and then invent the word.
Transformation. Try that one again.
Transformation.
We haven't used that in a while. Very good. I agree. The wild card in here, I do think people are, in the department and in industry, they are working, I honestly believe, in good faith. We do get this the stray voltage from, and it's meant to be helpful from the Hill. And sometimes that's helpful as a guide, but sometimes it's not that helpful. I mean, at the end of the day, if we could all agree on the first principles that we're trying to get our warfighter and our planners the best possible capability, and that may be a 15-year-old system, but with software tweaks can do new and amazing things. And we've made that sunk investment, and we have to think about how we can continue to leverage capabilities out of that. And I go back to the analogy in my dishwasher in my car. I'm not going to get a lot more capabilities out of my dishwasher, and so upgrading that software is not going to. I get new capabilities out of my car every day, and I don't consider those downloads every day sustainment. I consider them enhancements, and they are increasing the value of that sunk cost every day. I get those downloads, and that is the way I think we need to start thinking about software.
So when I first started really considering how we pay for software capability, especially after it's initially released, and I started looking at the different services about do they use RTD&E money, they use O&M money. It turns out all the services actually do it differently. Some of them actually do use O&M, depending on what percentage of this next release is fixes versus upgrades versus, you know what I mean, enhancements. So that's kind of tricky. One of the things that I will mention, and it's been released publicly on the Defense Innovation Board's website. So there's a proposal, Congress actually, in one of the NDAs in the past, this was Section 805, actually put in the law, hey, if you have good ideas, tell us about it, and we'll try to help. And I actually, it's funny, I actually find the relationship between the Pentagon and the Hill, I think we should do more to collaborate more effectively, because oftentimes Congress they're a bunch of well-meaning, smart people. They're not trying to make Pentagon's life harder. There's just not enough collaboration and communication sometimes so that they tell us the right things to do. So that's actually a little side. I'm sorry about that. But no, one of the things that the Defense Innovation Board is proposing is a new title. I think that's the right phrase. A new color of money, actually, for software, so that we don't have to continuously play this game of, are we using RTD&E for new capability only? Are we using O&M money? Ultimately, what Congress and the American people deserve is visibility and transparency in how the money gets spent and the capability it buys. That's what they want. And actually, if you ask them, one of the reasons they don't like using O&M money is it's such a big bucket. It's very opaque. Congress has no visibility of what all that O&M money gets spent on. So they want more transparency and visibility than that. So one of the proposals from the Defense Innovation Board is a new color of money. I don't know if the time is right for that to happen. That's actually a pretty heavy, I'm told, a pretty heavy lift, because it actually gets other non-DOD government agencies involved, OMB and GAO, or OMB, I think, and a couple others, to actually try to pull that off and make it happen. The folks that we've talked to at Congress and floated the idea, I think they're willing to try to pilot it, which is, we do that a lot. We pilot new things and see if they work, and then move forward if they do or not. So, but anyway, that's one of the proposals that's out there that we'll see if it's time for that.
Think they go with Bitcoin?
That'd be great if the next budget was released as Bitcoin. You stay away from Ethereum.
Well, it might have looked better a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But I would just, Jeff, add to that. I mentioned my prior life, I have sins from having been on the Hill, but there's color of money and there's color of money, and so it is a heavy lift. I think if you carefully think about some of the things Congress has done actually on the authorization side over the years. So if you look at CTR funding, which is technically considered O&M funding, but hey, it's 3-year money. Interesting. Can be used in a lot of different ways. Look at the Afghan Security Forces Fund, which is also technically O&M money, but also not 1-year money, also is able to buy equipment and make certain kinds of investments. So we have invented what I would think is effectively money with a color that takes on multi-hues without officially creating a new color of money per se. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space.
Yeah, Title III, it's no year, no color.
I want to, so we're talking money, so I want to bring up the profit issue, which has been referenced a couple of times. Beth talked about kind of the LPTA nature of a lot of what's happening in the business IT space and ERP world. But one of the things that is about, we talked about at the start, was getting the incentives right. And LPTA can be a successful model where people have, I'm going to put this may be a little inartful, they have something that they've already built and they're just selling it again. They're selling work previously done to you again. And so essentially they have a lot of flexibility on price, because they're not doing a lot of, there's a lot of new work involved in implementing an ERP, don't get me wrong, but on the development side, there's not a lot of new development happening, and so LPTA structure might work for that. But I would imagine in my own brain that when you're trying to develop something, LPTA is a really challenging model to try to apply to that work. So we may have, again, partly this issue of people look at software and they think, well, when I buy what I buy, that's already been developed and people are just selling it to me as one additional subscription among the many millions that they sell, that model works great. Why won't it work for me to go and pay someone to develop software, from the ground up specifically for my military purposes? But, I would say historically what we see is that industry has made its money on hardware, and to the extent that they have provided software to make that hardware work, kind of like in Brett's dishwasher example, it can just be something they throw in, right? They don't kind of charge separately for it. It's just part of the package. But in your car, I don't know that you're not actually probably paying a sustainment fee for those software updates there either. But how do we make that profitable for industry?
Car gets really expensive.
Well, I guess I'll start, because mine's going to be, I'll just say, again, more business IT focused. And again, I think LPTA is a tool, one of many tools that acquisition has at its disposal to use. I do feel like we get a little crazy on sort of, the pendulum swings, everything LPTA, just like we insource or outsource, it's sort of, we go back and forth. And the thing that flips us away from LPTA back to, I'll just say a broader competition is usually the results aren't exactly what we thought they would be. And some of this is we do market research, and people, again, I think well-intended say, oh, I can do that capability. And so you have a range of businesses, small and big, who say they can do these capabilities. And so you say, oh, I did the market research, and it said it's small business capability, and so I'm going to do, or I'll compete to everybody, but everybody says they can do it. And, I ask for past performance, and then I go to price. And so even with the big businesses, if you're a big business, and you're going for a competition, and they say price is not the most important factor, it's your experience. But then if you draw the, I'll just say the line in terms of, meet the requirements or exceed the requirements, it's almost like everybody can achieve the threshold, and therefore it becomes an LPTA. And I'm going to go all the way back to requirements to say you have to write the requirements such that you truly understand and can differentiate capability. Because if you just say, I need a wall and it's painted blue, everybody can do that, right? And then it becomes a price discussion. There needs to be a way to better articulate value that the government is looking for, so that the vendors can come in and say, I can do it this way, or here's my experience, and, there is no learning curve. And so I really feel like this, and I really didn't mean to harp on LPTA, but it gets to the profitability, because I think there also needs to be sort of a broad education. We want companies to make a profit so that we can maintain and sustain an industrial base. Without an industrial base, the government doesn't have its partnership that it needs to get the work done. And remember, the only time the government actually puts a contract or solicitation on the street is because they need help to do something. They don't have the skill sets, and so this has to be a partnership. And so it's this whole, conversation around acceptable profitability. People need to recognize we want industry to make a profit so that we have a sustained industrial base, and we want them investing their dollars into the future. And so we want them thinking, about the possibility of, depending on what business area you're in, how do I do that better? There's a different way. How do I employ blockchain to solve a problem? How do I, the whole AI, ML, thing you mentioned earlier. You want industry thinking about that so that they can bring these solutions to the government, again, to help achieve business outcomes. Again, mine's sort of in a business, but there are so many things that we actually want industry to invest in to then bring back to government, and so that it is this much more of a partnership going forward. But I do think there's some people in government who really are trying to cut profit as much as possible, and I'm not sure, exactly what the incentive on the government side is to do that. Again, I think reasonableness is completely fair and appropriate, but it's figuring out where's the balance.
Oh, I was just say, I almost always avoid getting into discussions of cost, because I want us, my argument is this: Congress gives us a budget, they give us a defense budget, whatever it is, $713 billion this year. We're going to spend every dime, probably. I want to get maximum capability as fast as possible to warfighters for every dime we spend. I don't like getting into the cost discussion because it almost always leads to bad incentives, in my view. So I think we're violently agreeing here that defining capability so that we can differentiate which vendor can bring me the most capability the quickest. I'm actually bullish on speed always too,
Yeah.
so that we don't have lost opportunity cost. Let's just pay what it takes to get that because it's such a strategic differentiator. And then the healthy industrial base, I think I opened with that because I don't know where we're going to buy a bunch of our 5G infrastructure, but it's probably, I don't know if there's a
I know
U.S.
one
company
place where
we
you're
can
not.
buy. Right, yeah, exactly. So, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, but I think these issues are connected. The way that our industrial base has evolved since the end of World War II lends itself to an increasingly smaller group of people who are dedicated in many ways largely to the service of national security and civil goals, and you need them in the type of economy we have to be profitable, but you also expect them to be profitable with purpose, that they are going to use those profits to reinvest in technologies and capabilities that can further the national security interests of the United States. And that's something you don't get from commercial firms. And so I think there is an expectation among the A&D firms that should be expected. The problem with the money and the amount of money is, as we've all seen, and we all have anecdotes about it. I mean, the Pentagon is very good, as I've said in the past, of solving million-dollar problems with billion-dollar solutions. They will use the resources available, and I worry sometimes that we're not reflective enough to figure out how we could get more bang for that buck, and that's a lot of what you're trying to do now. It's not necessarily a question of more resources. It's a question of doing things more smartly, and those resources are not going to exist in perpetuity. And in an area that's rapidly growing like software in terms of its importance, this is one we need to start to get right now because the resources are not going to be available to solve this issue with money in the future.
So I want to also bring up this idea that's been referenced earlier about intellectual property. So profit, I feel like we could sit down and have an hour-long discussion on where does profit come from and what it's not a favor the government is doing for industry. It is something necessary in our capitalist system to drive activity. But whatever reason we're doing it for, I think it's not terribly controversial to say that profit tends to follow intellectual property, and that this is a key aspect of what makes industry profitable over time. And it's again, it gets back to, Jeff, something you brought up when you started with, which is the government pays for a capability and then sometimes find that it's paying again for the same or very similar capability. And so there's an intellectual property issue, inherent in that side of the equation as well. So is there something different about intellectual property associated with software? I know we've seen a lot of activity on the Hill. Some of those sections you cited relate to intellectual property, and then some of their initial versions were very strong in giving the department extensive rights to intellectual property and software. Then to some extent, that was moderated a little bit in the final version. But we're really, I think, on the cusp of a major struggle, or maybe we're in the middle of a major struggle over intellectual property and software. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about what are the things we should be keeping in mind as we have that discussion?
Voice of officials.
Actually, yeah. I actually do remind people that I have no authority actually in the DoD. I have an influence. I have no authority. This is a tough one. If you look at the spectrum of people that talk about software IP, you've got the free and open source movement on the one end, and I really mean the free as in beer kind of Richard Stallman side, where we should not attach. You should not be able to patent software, right? Currently, software actually is only protected under copyright in most cases. So, but we should give it away free. And interestingly, that drives continued innovation in software really well, because I can't just do it once and profit on it for years and years and years, like Qualcomm did with their CDMA patents, for instance. And then it leads to continuously staying technologically relevant and advancing. So there's actually some goodness there that maybe we shouldn't try too hard to protect software IP because it forces innovation. And then there's that other far end of keep it all essentially lock it up forever, like sometimes is done with creative rights to things like Mickey Mouse, where it may never come out of copyright. But it's typically, I'm sure it's going to be a middle of the road solution that if I say DoD, pays a contractor, or pays somebody in the industrial base to develop a capability that is very key. Say it's a facial recognition, a trained facial recognition neural net, and we want to have multiple other weapon systems that are built by other vendors benefit from that. I hope the industry base helps us with this, but we have to find a way so those other weapon systems can reward the original developer of the capability, but also do it in a cost-effective way so that we can get that capability in as many places as possible. I'm not saying we should be able to just direct them to give it to those other programs for free, because I don't think that's right either. But we have to find a way that's a fine balance between letting them be rewarded appropriately, but maximizing the use of those things. Which brings something else up that we have to talk about is IP doesn't just apply to software. It applies to data more and more now. Training data sets are going to become, I think, part of the coin of the realm when we start talking about machine learning, that the effectiveness of my algorithm is about my data set, and it's not actually about, I mean, I think data sets are already a currency. If you look at Google's profit model, it's what they know about us, and Facebook's profit model for that instance. I don't know if I answered the question, but I've rambled for a minute, so I'll shut up for a little bit.
No, I think you're right on the data set. It's something that industry I know that's at least the parts of industry that are spending quite a bit internally on AI and ML realize that you may get to a point at some point where you give away the software because you don't care. Mm-hmm. What you are interested in is pulling from the data sets that can apply it. That's out there in the future, and in that way, software is, in my mind, a bit more like biology in that it's continuing to mature and change in real time, and so it's very hard to put a model other than line of code, cost per line of code on it, because more efficient, more effective capabilities can be done with much smaller systems or organisms, and our system is not set up to reward that. In fact, it's actually set up to disincentivize that type of behavior. And so independent of the IP, this idea of acquiring systems at a cost-plus basis does not get you very far down the evolutionary path. It does tend to reward people who like the current system. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for change. I'm not sure that the capacity, either in the department or in much of industry, is ready to do something that revolutionary yet.
So I'll round out the I'll call it dialogue. So in business IT, I honestly lost track of the number of times I've had a data rights discussion. Did the government buy the rights to the data? And you would be amazed how many times the answer back in the day was no. We didn't even think about it. We didn't invoke the appropriate data clause. And so probably in my last 10 years in the government, I became sort of bullish around, so what are the data rights? Because again, this is business IT. And we always thought, government would think, oh, we need the source code, because that's how we get the data. I'm like, well, no, not really. You don't need the source code. Why do you think you need the source code? Because I want the data. And I said, well, then invoke the right data clause so that you get the data. At the end of the day, you want the data. And so some of this, again, goes back to sort of educating and making sure that we've got the right clauses invoked, but also understanding what we buy and how we're buying it. So intellectual property, again, I want the software to continue to get better, and I want the best, I want the latest thing that's out there helping the business of government. That is what we want. And at the end of the day, now we have so much more data, and the algorithms behind the data. Honestly, I want the algorithms more than I want the source code, because I want to understand the math behind getting to the outcomes. But so this whole conversation around data rights, government purpose, all those kind of things, protection, that is, to me, amped up significantly on the business side. And it feels, I'll just say, that it should be less about IP, because now it's more about, really maximizing the capability of the piece of software. But I can't say that it's totally gone, and people are still looking at IP as a thing. I do think there is, if the government pays for a vendor to develop something, then it's a government resourced capability. If the vendors, and we want them to continue to use their own dime to do development, then they should keep the IP, right? And we should just use the heck out of it, again, to achieve the outcomes. But it's understanding the difference, and then the data rights. And then the whole notion of vendor lock, right? Sometimes, again, we don't know what we want. We have to ask such that the data is not coupled, I'll say, to the application. I can't tell you the number of times in the business IT space, and I'm positive it still exists today. We've got applications within the Department of Defense where the data and the application are so tightly coupled that you cannot move. And so it's figuring out, again, how to be a better buyer, how to understand what outcomes you're trying to achieve, and what's the role of government and industry. And it's not a, it's not a one-day conversation. It's a relationship that needs to be established, maintained, nurtured, et cetera, so that we have this much more of a partnership.
All right, well, we have just a little bit of time left, so I do want to open up to audience questions. I got so wrapped up in our conversation that I haven't done that earlier when I should have. So I want to turn to our audience, and we'll start in the front row here.
Hey, Justin Doubleday with Inside Defense. Jeff, I just wanted to ask again about this idea of IP and sharing software. Is this something that DoD may be piloting right now? Is this just a conversation in the building? Where does this go kind of here in the near term?
I think it's an ongoing conversation with industry to come up with better contract language and data rights languages that industry can best live with to protect their ability to leverage profit out of software, but also protect government's ability to make sure that we can maintain it or whatever with the 50-50 rule. We can spread its use. It is not a solved problem on this one. The other thing is, when we start talking IP, General Counsel needs to be involved, because I don't understand the way a lot of the actual contract language is written. So engaging them, and this is, oh, by the way, something else Congress told us to fix a while back, is establish an Office of Intellectual Property, and we haven't actually really done that. So that's a bad answer, but we're not as far along as we should be on this.
Hi, yes, Courtney Alvin with Inside Defense. Jeff, I wanted to ask about the F-35's transition into this continuous capability development and delivery for Block 4. Can you talk about some of the specific challenges the department is working through right now in that kind of preparing for that transition, and also what progress the program has made to kind of position itself for that? Yeah,
some of these lessons learned are directly from the F-35, but some of them are from other programs. So I want to speak a little more generally. Is one of the things we're learning is it's one thing to say we're going to radically create all these new contract types, right? But if you dramatically change the metrics that you use for incentives, you don't have a baseline from industry for past performance, so you don't know where to set the levels for incentives. So that's actually one of the challenges that the C2D2, the F-35 Block 4 software is going through right now. Is we're trying to get to a point where we deliver capability much more rapidly. We shift testing left as much as we can. We can be more responsive, and the software is higher quality. So there's a whole bunch of new metrics associated with that, rewarding that kind of agile development, that the contractor has no baseline for how well they're, what is sprint burn down rates? We don't have an established, should it be 50 or 1,000 or what, you know what I mean? So essentially one of the things we're currently doing is we're writing contracts, shorter term contracts that say, let's gather this data, and there's a whole bunch of new software metrics in there, and you get your full incentive fee if you just provide the data in a good way. It doesn't matter what the data says. And then the next generation contracts will be able to then say, okay, now we've got a decent baseline so we can incentivize continuous improvement on those metrics. And then we got to make sure that the metrics don't have perverse incentives, and because you always get what you measure and all this other stuff. So I think that's one of the big challenges. But the shout out to the folks over in the program office. Ryan Mueller is the Air Force colonel who's leading a lot of that development. He's doing a very good job working with the customer, and it's him and the folks at Lockheed Aero working together to get to better metrics, get to more regular delivery, get to higher quality software, and it really is a partnership, actually. So, and we talk about, we don't have enough time for this, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. We talk about vendor lock. I agree in principle we want to avoid vendor lock, but in massive numbers of cases we have vendor lock for huge chunks of money. We can't buy the F-35 from anybody but Lockheed. I mean, there's a lot of elements of the air system that we can recompete for different components, but by and large, 70 years, we're in, right? Aegis, we've been at the same contractor for 40 years with Aegis. I don't think another company could do it because of the developed expertise in infrastructure. So we have to sometimes accept or admit that we've got some level of vendor lock and try to drive the best quality and capability for the lowest cost, and that sort of should become the narrative more than, I'm going to outcompete you and put you out of business, or you know what I mean. That's never healthy. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Hey, thanks. Good discussion. A couple of topics that were mentioned. Go back to standards-based open source was mentioned as a key aspect, and then the level of abstraction and the intellectual property to facilitate sharing. So I serve as a CTO for a consortium of software innovation around geospatial software. And so we're looking at innovative processes around hackathons, involving developers very early to develop software innovation that results in standards for interoperability is what we do. So we've done a couple of hackathons, and they're always a little bit different with respect to their objectives. And one of the challenges we've run into on hackathons that are very early in the process is to for example, elicit requirements. So, developers tend to think in code. That's how they think. They write code. They guess with code. And out of that, in early hackathons is requirements. And so instead of, I'm a system engineer, you write the requirements, code's going to pop out to meet those requirements. It's all machine driven. It's really great. That ain't it. It's about how can we use software to think and drive requirements. The challenge, the cultural challenge that came up with a government sponsor for this hackathon was, I want that code. I want that very early code as a deliverable because I paid for it, and it's something I want to build a product around, where in no case whatsoever was that code anywhere close to being a product to build on. It was a thought experiment. And so there was also mention of different points in the development cycle with respect to code and open source. So is there cultural change there with respect to procurement around hackathons not requiring delivery of open source code? That's maybe a lot.
I don't know. I'd just say if at the end of the day you didn't think the code really worked, I would have sold it. But I don't know in terms of sponsorships how the government does that. I know it's a normal term and condition of any government when they do these things that I think it's more a set piece of legalese that goes in. There's no reason it could not be removed, but I think that would come from the intellectual property office that sounds like they're still in the process of setting up.
I'm gonna get in a lot of trouble when I get back to the Pentagon.
No, it'll be ready by the time you get back.
Right? Yeah. I don't know. So things like hackathons and these innovation events, I wasn't aware that we tried to productize code from those things, because I think that sounds like a terrible idea.
I think you just own it
by the nature of it, right?
I think it's just a term and condition in the contract that you have the rights to everything. So it's not that they're going to do anything with it.
Right.
They just want to assert the right to do something with it.
They did want to assert, but it produced a situation in the development environment in which there was anticipated that they were going to do something with it, and therefore risk taking went down. It was, you're going to turn that into a product, so I'm going to stop doing the innovative stuff and focus.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I would argue for those kinds of innovation events, we would actually want people to feel as safe as possible protecting their IP so that they can develop it to a point where it can be commercialized. I don't think government should try to commercialize things. I think we're terrible at that. I think we should incentivize industry to commercialize things, and actually dual-use technologies are some of the best, something that we can help demonstrate a need for and an investment in that gets us to a capability that also has a really good commercial capability. I think that's like the best case, because there's profit and there's a whole other customer base to help shape and improve that product. I think InQtel does that really well. I think when they invest in startups, they actually have a requirement that anything you develop for us, you also have to include in your commercial product so that it sees continuous development. So.
All right, well, we have come to the end of our 90 minutes. I really want to thank the panel for a great discussion. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. So in addition to thanking them, I just want to let folks know that this is a topic that we're going to continue to work on here. Jeff made reference to that because I had discussed that with him very briefly at the back in the green room. So keep your eyes out for some more thought pieces from CSIS and more events on this topic. Thank you.